Tonight, I want to first off thank you for going on this pilgrimage with me, joining me and going with me each night. I know the sacrifice, I know how hard it is. I remember before I became a full time pastor, working full time and then rushing off to do things at the church and being part of teaching opportunities and revival services. I know the sacrifice you've made, and I thank you for that. I thank you that you took the time to go on the pilgrimage, but I also pray that though we're on this joint pilgrimage together, it ends tonight. I pray that your individual pilgrimage will continue and that you will take time to get that handout back out. And if you don't have it, Ron can get you another copy of it. And I challenge you to go to the prophets, to go to the gospel writers, to go to Peter, and look and see how they used the 23rd Psalm. Do a study, look into it. There's some really exciting information there for you if you'll just take the time to take it and look at it. So before we start tonight's message, and again, this was one of those situations that I had two sermons, and I prayed about them last night, and I went to bed, and I thought, I don't have to get up early tomorrow. I'll sleep in. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I got leg cramps in both legs, and God said, no, you're getting up. I had leg cramps all night long, and I was up. But then both legs got cramped at 4 o'clock, so I got up, and I went back, and I reviewed both sermons. And then God told me what to do tonight. And so I'll share that with you. But before I do, what have you learned on this pilgrimage together? What have you learned? What has God said to you? Plato wrote in his writing The Republic, he wrote about a thing called the cave. And if you've never read it, you ought to look it up online or find it at the library and read Plato's The Cave. And it talks about how we dwell in this cave and all we see are these shadows on the wall because there's a light behind us and we've never seen the light. We've only seen the shadows. And if we turn around, we'll see the light. And that's not even the real light. It's when you walk out of the cave that you find the real light. But many of us, we see the real light and it terrifies us, and we run back in, we put the shackles back on, we sit down and watch the shadows. We don't want to do that. We don't be set free. And though we walk through the valleys, whatever they may be, or the seas of distress, and it may appear that God's walking past us, remember, He's walking past us to be able to lead us and to knock down the waves so that we can get where we're going. Well, I want us to wrap up tonight. I want to share with you two passages from the sermon I'm not going to preach to you tonight, but it's the two passages that actually relate to what I'm going to ask you to do from the sermon tonight. In the 23rd Psalm's usage in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 10, verse 16, Jesus said to the sheep, I have other sheep which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. Now, Jesus said this to the disciples, and He said this for us to understand that there are lots of other sheep out there that are not a part of the flock, and it's our responsibility to go to them and to reach them. The title of the sermon I am not preaching to you comes from John 20, verse 21, again a part of the 23rd Psalm's usage, where Jesus says, as my Father hath sent me, even so send I you. And so I want to say to you tonight, even so send I you. And I want all of you to think about what I'm going to share with you tonight about taking this information and going because you have been now officially sent. If you read in the Gospels about how Jesus sent out the 12 and he sent them out two by two, and then later he sent out to 70, and he sent them out two by two. They were all sent out to do the same thing, to go and to reach the lost sheep and bring them in, to be a part of one flock with one shepherd. I told you that Debbie and I have lived in, Illinois and Iowa and Missouri and Nevada and Canada. And when we lived in Canada and served at the International Church there, and I was a pastor, as I told you, of a multi-congregational church. We had multiple congregations meeting in the same building. I was senior pastor of all those congregations, and they were language churches for the majority. Two of them were Canadian churches, but the others were not. One of my associates that helped me with one of the particular congregations was a man named Wajdi Iskander. And Wajdi was a North Sudanese former Muslim. He had been brought up in North Sudan, and he had been brought up as a devout Muslim. He became a believer in Christ when he was still in Sudan. And there came a point in time where he and two other believers, and Wajdi was a brand new believer. He was very, very new as a believer. He had just converted from Islam to Christianity when he got arrested with the other two guys. And they were taken to jail, the three of them. And they were incarcerated for being believers in Jesus Christ. And while they were in jail, what transpired and took place was that the guards came in on the first Saturday that they were incarcerated, and they grabbed the strongest of the three believers, and they hauled him out of the cell. And as he was going out, he kept saying to Wajdi, but by his original name, Wajdi is not his real name. He kept saying to him, brother, keep the faith, keep the faith, keep the faith. And they hauled this gentleman out right outside the window cell where the other two who were still incarcerated could look out and see, and they shot him. The following Saturday, they came and opened the cell again, and they took the next strongest Christian, and they hauled him out of the cell, and he too kept saying, Wajdi, keep the faith. Keep the faith, brother. Keep the faith. And they hauled him outside the window and shot and killed him. Now, Wajdi is frantic. He's freaking out. He knows that his destination is to the following Saturday be drug out of the cell, taken outside the window, and shot and killed. Third Saturday arrives. The guards come in. They fling open the door. And Wajdi is keeping the faith. He's ready to go. He's ready to go meet Jesus. And the guard said, get out of here. And he kicked him out. And he's dumbfounded. Why? What's going on? And he said, the civil war has started again. You see, the North Sudanese and the South Sudanese. North Sudanese are Muslim. The South Sudanese are a part of the African Christian movement in Sudan, and they were always in a civil war, and the war has started again. All the guards have been activated to go back to be soldiers, and they just let him go. And he fled Sudan by walking across the desert, across the chalk wilderness, very similar to what we've been talking about with the shepherd and the sheep. And he ended up arriving in Canada, where he went to a Bible college, became a teacher, became a preacher, and I brought him on staff to help me plant the Arabic congregation, and he was fabulous at it. Now, I told you his name is Wajdi Iskander. That's not his real name. He had to change his name because they were always constantly hunting for him, always looking for him, and they would call, and they would ask for this other name, and we'd say, no, he's not here, and then they would call, and they'd ask for Wajdi Iskander, and we'd have to say, no, he's not here, and hang up because they were wanting to find him to kill him. And he served with us for a number of years, and after I left Canada and went to Nevada, he continued serving there, and then eventually he retired. He resigned from that position, and he started traveling the world, and the last time we saw him face to face, he was on his way back to Sudan. Now, he'd been told if he returns to Sudan, they were going to kill him, but he was heading to Sudan. And he was heading there in order to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with people in his home country. And he was going, and he was telling us that he had already been threatened, and that when he arrived there, he had some people he had already encountered in one of the refugee camps, and he was going to go baptize these 8 people, and they had already warned him that people were going to be in the crowd, and they were going to kill him. But he was still going. He was still going. And Debbie and I both say, why are you doing this? He said, I haven't had a bloody nose for Jesus in a long time. And he went. And then he contacted us when he finally returned, weeks later. He said he went into the waters to do the baptism. They do live water baptism. He was in the water. They had 8 baptismal gowns that the 8 candidates put on, and he would baptize them, and they would walk out. And the very first lady that he baptized her, and she praised the Lord, and she walked out. And as soon as she came out of the water, one of the guys that had come to kill Vashti grabbed her and said, "Give me your robe." And she fought with him and said no, but he took the robe from her, and she's terrified, and he walks into the water. And he's going there, and she thinks he's going to kill Vashti. And he gets into the water and looks into Vashti's face, and Vashti looks into his, and he says, "I believe." And Vashti baptized him, and when he came out, somebody else took the robe, and when others came out, somebody else took the robe, and the 8 turned into a multitude of people who got saved watching 8 baptisms. Vashti still travels the world doing this. He goes to locations that they are life-threatening. But he knows that though he walks through the valley of the shadow of darkness, he has to fear no evil. And he does it again and again and again and again. Constantly. He's been in Egypt. He's been in Sudan. He's been in Iran. He's been in Iraq. He's been all over the Middle East sharing the gospel. One man. If you have your Bibles tonight, and you should have your Bibles, if you open to 1 Samuel chapter 14. 1 Samuel chapter 14, the title of tonight's message is, "What Difference Can One Make?" Subtitled, "The Power of One." Vashti made a huge difference. And I didn't tell you was that after I had left Canada, he was instrumental in starting other Arabic congregations. Now, the Arabic congregations were multinational. There were Turks, and there were Iranians, there were Iraqis, there were Sudanese, and eventually he ended up planting a South Sudanese church. A South Sudanese. These are the ones they've been at civil war with for generations. And Vashti becomes the pastor, a North Sudanese becomes the pastor of a South Sudanese church. And so he's not only preaching in Arabic, he's preaching in Sudanese, but he's also preaching in Spanish, because all the children of the South Sudanese sent their kids off to Cuba, where it was safer than being in Sudan. And so he was speaking in multiple languages, preaching the gospel, one man. What difference does one man make? Typically, when I share this message, and I've done this way long time ago, Ron, you may have even heard it before, I utilize illustrations from the Civil War. I am a Civil War buff. My family is descendants of Stonewall Jackson, and so we kind of have this built into our blood to want to know more about that. And I've studied it, and we've been to multiple Civil War battlefields. We've looked at things, we've studied things, we looked at both sides of the conflict. We're also from the land of Lincoln, so Abraham Lincoln is a part. The thing is, I'm really poor because I lived in Springfield, Illinois, where was the home of Abraham Lincoln, and I never went to Lincoln's home until I started dating my wife, and she made me go. And she said, "You've lived here all this time and you've never been?" No, I've never been. But we've been a few times after that. And one of the stories that I've studied from the Civil War is about a man named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was in charge of the Maine brigade, battalion. He was a school teacher who became a colonel to lead that group. And at the Battle of Gettysburg, he was stationed on the top of Little Round Top. I don't know if you know anything about that, but it was kind of the hinge point for the battle at Gettysburg. And he was told to protect Little Round Top no matter what. He had to protect it. He had to hold the ground. And he was there with a small battalion of men, and they got down to where they had 3 bullets per man. And the enemy just kept coming time and time and time and time again. And finally, they were going to be attacked again, and they knew if they lost that battle, the whole Battle of Gettysburg was going to be over, and hundreds more lives were going to be lost. And so what Chamberlain did was he told his men, "Take your 3 bullets, load up," and he stood up and he shouted, "Charge." And they charged the enemy, and so terrified the enemy as they come running down from the top of Little Round Top that the enemy scattered and ran away, and they didn't get defeated. They held the ground. He later won a Medal of Honor for his actions and was promoted to general, all because one man chose to shout "charge" instead of surrender. And that was the illustration that I was going to use to help you see what happens in this passage here in 1 Samuel. So let me set the stage for you of what's happening in this biblical story here, very similar to the Battle of Little Round Top, very similar to some of the things that Vashti was doing and others. I mean, I have a whole list here in my notes, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Abraham Lincoln, Audie Murphy, Lee Harvey Oswald, Osama bin Laden, Charlie Kirk, Corrie ten Boom, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, all people who have made significant differences. And all of these people have made radical differences just by being the one who stood up and shouted "charge," the one who held the ground, the one who did what needed to be done, the one who spoke the word of truth. Here in the passage of what we're going to look at, I'm going to share some verses from other parts of 1 Samuel, but we're going to eventually look very closely at the first verse in chapter 14. You have the nation of Israel have gotten to a point that they decided that they wanted a king. They wanted a human king. And so they kept pushing God, saying, "Give us a king, give us a king, give us a king." And God kept saying, "You got a king." They said, No. We want a king like the rest of the countries. We want a human king. We want someone to be our king. We want someone to lead us in battle. And so they kept asking and asking and asking. And they refused to obey the voice of Samuel, the prophet. And they kept saying, "We want a king over us." If you look at 1 Samuel 8, verses 19 and 20, you don't have to turn there. He says, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all of the other nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." And finally, God says, "Okay, you keep asking for a greed, a want instead of a need, but I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to give you what you keep asking for." And sometimes God gives us what we keep asking for, even though it's not what we need, it's what we want. And so he said to the nation of Israel, "I will give you a king." He said, "But if you have a king, the king is required to be an Israelite. He must follow 3 major restrictions. The king must not acquire many horses, must not acquire many wives, must not acquire excessive silver and gold. That's from Deuteronomy 17. He says you can't, as king, you can't have those things. The final thing is, as a king, you must be on the battlefield when your army is on the battlefield. Now, that's what's the requirements to be the king of Israel. You had to be an Israelite. You couldn't have a lot of horses. You couldn't have a lot of wives. And you couldn't have excessive silver and gold. You could only have one wife, by the way. Think about the kings that follow Saul. He's the first king. Think about the kings that follow. Saul accumulated great wealth. Lots of silver, lots of gold, lots of horses. David will also acquire lots of wealth. Solomon, who will follow, will have a multitude of wives and concubines, all in violation of God's commands. Remember when we talked about the characteristics of David? One was he was an adulterer. And I told you how he stood on the roof and he looked over the roof and he saw Bathsheba taking a bath. And I told you if he'd have turned around and went the other way, he would have been okay. But he kept looking. And he kept looking. Well, most of the time I'll say that the sin that David committed was he kept looking. And then once we put things into our mind, and we see things and we hear things and we act upon what we see and what we hear. And I could do a thing with you to help you understand that, but we don't have time tonight. But try it sometime. Sometime to try to think about the number 5 for like 15 seconds and then stop thinking about the number 5. Don't think about it anymore. And if I were doing that with you for the whole 15 seconds, I would keep telling you, don't think about the number 5. Stop thinking about the number 5. You got 10 more seconds. That's 5 times 2. Don't think about the number 5. And then I ask you after 15 seconds, did you stop thinking about the number 5? The problem is once we put something in our mind, once we see something, once we hear something, we then kick in our emotions, and our emotion causes us to do actions. And that's what David did. But David's real sin wasn't the fact that he did that. The sin that he committed was the fact he was on the roof in the first place. Because the army was in the field. And David was in the palace. And the command was, if the army is in the field, so must you as king be in the field. You must lead in front, not from behind. So God allows Samuel to pick a man to be their leader. And he picks Saul. And he anoints Saul to be the king. Now, Saul, if you know anything about him, was a good-looking man. He had good stature. He had great charm. He had leadership skills. But despite his humble backgrounds of what he came from to become king, he was arrogant, he was prideful, he was jealous, and he had all these negative things as well. And so, because Saul was that kind of person, Saul decides that he's going to wage war with the Philistines. And he's going to go to battle against the Philistines. And so he leads the army of Israel, he leads them out to go and to battle with the Philistines. And in 1 Samuel 13, verses 5 through 7, it says, the Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And they went up and they camped at Michmash, east of Beth Aven. And so the Philistine army has come with all these, 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, multitudes of soldiers, all of them armed. Because, the Philistines, their background was they were the workers of iron. They had learned how to make iron. Up until this point, all weapons of war and even weapons of farming were made out of bronze or out of brass, and they would bend and they would break, but they had learned how to make iron. And so they were all armed with iron, including The wheels of the chariots were iron rimmed, not wooden. They had swords. They had iron pointed spears and lances. They had the iron rimmed wheels of their chariots. Not only that, they had the advantage because the Philistines were so strong that when the small nation of Israel was being formed, the Philistines figured out that if they taught the Israelites how to work iron, there would be a problem. They could make weapons of war. So that was not allowed. If you wanted any iron work done, if you wanted any blacksmithing done, you had to go to a blacksmith who was a Philistine. In 1 Samuel 13, verses 19-20, it says, "Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears." So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, their mattocks, their axes, and their sickles sharpened. They couldn't even sharpen their own farming implements. So now King Saul decides that's who he's going to go wage war with. And the army of the Philistines have come out. They're out just outside of Bethaven, and they're there, and they're ready to wage war. In 1 Samuel 13, verse 22, it says, "So it came about on the day of the battle that neither sword nor spear was found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan. But they were found with Saul and his son Jonathan." So you have the army of Israel, and we're going to find out that the army of Israel there was 1,000 men who were with Jonathan and 600 men who were with Saul, and they do not have any weapons of war except what the king and his son had. So you're going up against 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, a multitude of army men, all of them with weapons of iron. And you're the Israeli army. You have 1,000 men who are with Jonathan, 600 men who are with Saul, and you have 2 swords and 2 spears, and that's it. Now let me ask you, which camp do you want to be in? Because if you continue reading in this chapter 13, you find that when they see this happening, when they see the Philistines come out, that a lot of the Israelites, they go and they hide in the caves and in the cisterns. And some of them went over to Gad and Gilead. They went over to the other side. Those two are Philistine communities. They packed up and they went over to the other side. They weren't stupid. They had 2 swords and 2 spears. Yeah, they had their axes and they had their plowshares and they had, those weapons of farming, but they were nothing in comparison to the weapons of war the Philistines had. So let me ask you again, where would you find yourself? Where would you be? Honestly, not your Sunday school answer. Where would you be? The battle's going to take place at sunrise tomorrow. Where are you going to find yourself tonight? You'd be fleeing. You'd be in the cisterns, in the caves, going over to the enemy, to Gad and Gilead. Anybody else honest? Where would you be? Anybody? Hey, listen, I served in the military. John, you served in the military. If I saw the enemy looking like that, I know where I'd be. Hiding in the cisterns, hiding in the caves. Not really. But where would you be? And so this is the scene. This is what's happening. Saul, this great king, the king that Israel wanted and didn't want God as their king, this great king who had no plan, no strategy, but no vision. The scripture says that without a vision, the people will perish or run amok, wander around in lostness. What was he thinking? He's going against the Philistines. He knew who the Philistines were. They were big people to begin with. They had giants. Yes, there were giants in that day. They had giants. Tall, big men. They had weapons of war made out of iron. And they had 2 swords and 2 spears. That's it. What can 1,600 men do against a multitude? What can 2 swords and 2 spears do against the Philistine army? Well, I'm going to tell you, it's even worse than that. Look with me in chapter 14, starting with verse 1. One day, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man bearing his armor, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. So what you have is kind of that Wadi type situation where they're about to do war. There's this side of the wadi and this side of the wadi, and there's these outposts on the top of the wadis, and you got the Philistines over here, and you got Jonathan and his armor bearer and some of his men over here, and Jonathan goes all the way up to the edge of the wadi, and he's standing there, and the Philistines are of course yelling back and forth to him saying, come on over, you Jewish pig, I'll take care of you." That's what they keep saying to him over and over and over again. In verse 4, so on each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One cliff stood to the north towards Michmash, the other to the south towards Geba. And Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come on, let's go to the outposts of those uncircumcised fellows. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." He says, "Come on, let's go. Let's see what they're going to do." And when they get there and they're on those opposite sides of that ravine, on those 2 cliffs, again, the Philistines keep harassing them, saying, come on over, we'll take care of you, come on over. It says, Jonathan says to the young armor bearer, "Come on, let's go see. God can do anything. He can save with few or he can save with many." And the young armor bearer says, "Do all that you have in mind. Go ahead, I'm with you, heart and soul." And Jonathan said, "Come then, we will cross over towards the men and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we'll stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because they will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistines' outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." And the men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan, his armor bearer, "Come on up to us and we'll teach you a lesson. Come on up." Jonathan, one man, an armor bearer, a teen, actually more likely a preteen, who's carrying his armor, his sword, and his lance. And Jonathan says to him, "Let's go. If they say, 'Stay there, we're coming,' we'll stay here. But if they say, 'Come on over,' we know that God has given them into our hands." So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." And Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet, with his armor bearer right behind him. And the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan, his armor bearer, killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. Then panic struck the whole army, and those in the camp and the field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties. And the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Verse 20, then Saul and all his men assembled 600 and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. The Hebrews who had been previously been with the Philistines, those who had gone over as traders, had gone up with them to their new camp, went over to the Israelites. They came back to the army of Israel. And with all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. And the Lord rescued Israel that day, and the battle moved beyond to Bethaven. Jonathan says to his armor bearer, let's go see what God's going to do. And they climb up across from the wadi and they listen to the Philistines. And the Philistines say, come on over here and we'll teach you a lesson. Come on, you pigs. We'll take care of you. So Jonathan says, let's go. And he climbs down and he climbs up. And when you read it, it says that he climbs with his hands and his feet. He climbs up to the top of the outpost on the other side. And as he's walking into the camp, the Philistines are falling on the ground in front of him. And the armor bearer, who's carrying the sword, who's carrying the lance, is the one who kills them. Jonathan's unarmed. And he's walking into the enemy, that camp with a multitude of men, with 600 chariots, with 1,200 charioteers. He's walking into the midst of that, and he's going before them. And they're falling one by one and be putting to death. Within a half an acre, he kills 20 men. His armor bearer does. One man and a boy. One man and a boy. You see, if you have faith, which we talked about tonight, I told you, I was going to preach on it. If you have faith, if you have acting faith, you begin to see the opportunities that God's going to give you. If you take the faith that you have learned about all of these years, if you take the faith that God's been talking to you about on this pilgrimage, if you take that faith and you use it as acting faith, God will show you opportunities to defeat the enemy. To defeat him. He's going to show you opportunities. Jonathan walked into that camp because he saw God giving him the opportunity to defeat the enemy. He says, nothing can hinder the Lord from saving. Nothing can stop God from saving, whether by many or by few or by one. Wajdi packed up, left the security and the safety of Canada, went back to the Middle East numerous times, went back to Sudan numerous times to be able to share the gospel and see people saved in his home country. Time and time and time and time again. We had a lady that was a part of his church. Her name was Kendall. Her name meant candle. She was a singer for the King of Morocco. That was her job. She was a singer for the King of Morocco. Her husband was the captain of the guard for the King of Morocco. And they became believers and were kicked out. And they were kicked out not only of the palace and of their roles, but kicked out of the country. And they were told, don't come back. And they ended up in Canada. And her husband, who was so mad at her because she became a believer and was listening to Christianity, she hadn't thoroughly embraced Christ yet. He went off one day, and while she was at home with their son, somebody came knocking on the door, and she opened the door, and this guy said, get out, your husband sold me the house, you're now homeless. And he kicked her and her son out in the cold of winter in Canada, and she rode the bus and rode the bus and rode the bus till she met a Christian woman who invited her home. Kendall stopped singing for the King of Morocco and started singing for the King of Kings. But she went back to Morocco where she was not supposed to go to share the gospel with her family because she had sent Christian letters to her mother and to her brothers and sisters. And one brother was heard reading the letter to her mother, and he was arrested and thrown in jail, so she had to go get him out. So she thought. And she went back, and they arrested her. And she called the Canadian embassy, and they got her out and told her never go back. And you know what she did? She keeps going back. One person. What can one person do? We need to have the faith of Jonathan. We need to have acting faith. And where does that faith come from? Henry Blackaby, in his book Experiencing God, have you done Experiencing God here? Anybody? Anybody? Oh, wrong. You need to have a study on Experiencing God by Henry Blackaby. I knew Henry, and I know his son Richard, and all of the kids that are the family of the Blackabys. Richard Blackaby was the guy who was in charge of my doctoral thesis. I graduated from Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City, and I also graduated from the Canadian Baptist Seminary in Cochrane, Alberta at the same time. I have a dual degree from those two seminaries. And, we studied Experiencing God because I got to know the family and know how Henry wrote this and why he wrote this and all. And in that study, he will tell you that we need to know God in order to love God, in order to believe God, in order to trust God, in order to obey God. And if we come to know Him and we come to know about Him and we come to love Him, we will come to the point where we will believe in Him and we will trust Him and obey Him. Oftentimes, we want new believers who have just learned about knowing Him and loving Him to start obeying Him, and they haven't learned how to believe Him and trust in Him yet. But if we are doing these things, if we know who God is, we're taking time to learn who God is, to know Him in order that we might love Him. When I met my wife, I was attending the Methodist church, she was attending the Baptist church. And her dad said that I could date her once a week, and I could see her if I went to church anytime and as often as I wanted. So guess what we did as teenagers? We went to church all the time so I could see her. But we had to get to know each other. I would call her at night on the phone, and I would talk to her for hours, getting to know her, be able to love her, be able to believe who she is for her reality of the person that she is, to be able to trust her and to go together. Same with God. We've got to spend time getting to know God in order to love Him and love Him deeper, to be able to believe Him more and more, to be able to trust Him and to be able to obey Him. And that's what Jonathan did. He knew God. He loved God. He believed in God. And he trusted God because he said to his armor bearer, if they say, come on over, God's given them into our hands, let's go. And he climbed down and he climbed up the wadi with no weapon in his hands because he believed God. He trusted God and he was obeying God because God said, they're yours. Come get them. And he didn't have to touch them. He just had to walk towards them. Sometimes when Satan is trying to attack us, we just need to walk towards him. The Bible says, resist the devil, submit yourself therefore unto God, resist the devil, and he must flee from you. Run away. We need to do what God's telling us to do and step out in faith and go and do it, believing that God is going to give us whatever we need. I teach and preach a message that talks about that when God calls us to do something, He gives us whatever we need to be able to do it. He told the 70, He told the 12 when He sent them out 2 by 2, He said, don't take with you an extra robe, extra sandals, a bag of money. Don't take anything with you, just go. He didn't care if he had those things. He wanted them just to trust Him. And so they went out to do it, trusting God. And we need to do the same. And we may say, well, I don't have this to be able to do that, God. Well, you don't have it because you don't need it yet. Once you go, you'll need it. He'll give it to you. That's what Jonathan did. He didn't know how he was going to defeat all those people on the other side. But he went. He had a sword and a spear and one teenage boy, preteen, with him. But he went. Sometimes God's going to ask you to do something that you're going to look and say, how do I do this? How do I go to the neighbor and knock on the door and share the gospel with them? How do I start a home outreach Bible study in my home or my place of business? I told you I was a tax collector. I left the mission field, came back to Illinois, and became a tax collector for the Department of Illinois in the state of Illinois. And when I was there, guess what I did? I started a Bible study in the Department of Revenue at lunchtime. I started a Bible study. I started discipling everybody that I was working with. I could have got fired. I was in a state office building. But it didn't matter because God told me to do it. Grow a church. How do you grow a church? How do you do things that we've never done before? You know, a friend of mine wrote a book years ago. It's called The 7 Last Words of the Church. You know what the 7 last words of a church are? We've never done it that way before. Count the words. We've never done it that way before. That's the 7 last words of the church, because when you start saying that, that's the end of the church. You're on the downward slide into death. It's when we say, hey, we've never done it that way before, let's do it, that God begins to empower and strengthen. Now, I don't believe in change for the sake of change, but I believe in change when God says to change. Because you know what? That's what the gospel is. The gospel is about transformation. Transformation is change. God wants to transform you into the image of His Son. He wants to change you. He wants to bring about and alter who you are so that you might walk in the newness of life with Christ. That's what the gospel is all about. It's about change. Henry, in Experiencing God, will tell you that you need to go out and look to see where God's at work in the world and join Him. God gives you an invitation, invites you to join Him. You have to go through a challenge of faith at that point, because God is asking you to go do something. You have to believe, can I do this? Will God do this through me? Do I have the ability to do this? You know what? I am an introvert personified. I am terrified of speaking in front of people. I crammed 4 years of college into 15, and part of the reason I crammed 4 years of college into 15 was I kept changing universities till I found one that didn't require speech, because I couldn't take speech. I knew I would flunk it. Couldn't do it. I found one. It's not true anymore, but at the time, Southwest Baptist University in Bolivar, Missouri did not require speech to graduate. I graduated from Southwest Baptist because I finally found one. I can't speak in front of people. I still can't. I'm not doing it right now. The Lord is. I just learned I got to get out of His way so He can talk. When I start talking, that's when everything starts going crazy. God can do it if we allow Him to work in our lives. I told Henry a few years ago when he was putting out all the books on experiencing God, and there are a lot of them out there on the market, and I told Henry, I said, Henry, why haven't you written a book on discovering where God's at work in the world? How do we discover where God's at work in the world so we can join Him? And Henry said, that's a good idea, and he never wrote it. He never wrote it. Now Henry is sitting with the Lord in the kingdom of heaven, and he's not written the book. So I told his son Richard, I saw Richard here about 2 years ago, and I said, Richard, you need to write a book about how to discover where God's at work in the world so that we can join Him. And Richard said, that's a good idea. 2 years, still not written. I don't think it's going to happen. Because I finally realized we don't need a book to tell us how to discover where God's at work. We just need to listen to the Spirit of God in our lives and start seeing the opportunities that God has out there, and that's where God's at work. If you've ever read, and if you do, and you will, Henry talks about when he started doing work on a college campus, and they were trying to figure out how to get Bible studies going, how to do these Bible studies, and they were talking about it, and they would pray about it, and they send the students that were a part of their study out, and they kept coming back saying, well, this person wants us to start a Bible study in this dorm, and this person wants to start a Bible study in this dorm, and God was just opening the door once they started looking. If we take the faith that we have learned about and we've journeyed with God with and been on this pilgrimage with God learning more about, If we take that faith and make it acting faith, remember, it's not enough just to be put on the path of righteousness. You've got to follow him on the path. If we start following him on the path of righteousness and we start looking, we will see opportunities to share the gospel of Jesus Christ, to put it into action, to do what God has called us to do. We need to be looking. I used to pray, God, give me an opportunity tomorrow to share the gospel. And then I realized that was the wrong prayer. I needed to pray, God, help me see the opportunities tomorrow, because God was always giving them to me. I just wasn't seeing them. Or if I did, I was terrified and wouldn't take them. Acting faith requires us to see the opportunities that God has for us to put faith into action. We cannot be like the Israelites before Jonathan went over and started routing the enemy. We cannot be hiding in the cisterns and the caves. You want me to spell the word cistern for you? It's C-H-U-R-C-H. Church. We hide in these buildings because we're comfortable here. We know what to expect here. We like it here. But God didn't tell us to stay in here. He didn't stay in the cave and in the cisterns. He told us to go out and put our faith into action. And sometimes, because we stay in the cistern and the caves, sometimes we get to the point where we think, well, I just am going to go over to the other side. I'm just going to give up. I'm just going to go away. And people walk away from the church. And you find them going back to the old man. I did. I left the church. And I went back to try to be the old man again. Debbie and I were dating. Her stepmother did not like me, and she actually hated me. And I just ran. I ran back to the old life. I did more sinful things after I became a believer than I ever did before I was a believer, because I ran away. And I was hiding in the cisterns and the caves, and I was running from God. And God finally got a hold of me and shook me and said, no, you can't go into Gad and Gilead. You need to stay with the family of God. We were married. We had our first son before we ever went back to church. The pastor and a deacon came to visit us. No pastor had ever been in my house, ever. And he came to visit us, and he said, you guys need to be coming back to church. I said, yeah, I need to get Josh, my oldest son, I need to get him into church. And the deacon looked at me and said, no, Dan, you need to get into church. Not Josh. Josh will follow what you do. It's time to come home. It's time to be restored. It's time to come back to the family of God. The second thing about acting faith as we look at this here is acting faith is contagious. It's contagious. If just one of you steps out in faith, starting tonight, if you step out in faith and do what God's calling you to do, whatever it may be, no matter how ridiculous it may sound, if you step out in faith, it will be contagious for others to follow. Jonathan says to his armor bearer, hey, let's go up and let's see what the Philistines are doing. We'll be at our side of the cliff and they'll be on their side. And the armor bearer says, I'm with you, heart and soul, I'm with you, let's go. What Jonathan's faith was doing was being contagious for the young armor bearer. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a soldier. His job was to polish the armor and put it on. His job was to cook the meals and make sure that Jonathan had food. He wasn't there to kill people and to do battle and wage war, but he says, hey, I'm ready. Let's go. Let's do it. And so he and Jonathan go, and they go down and they climb up. And the young armor bearer, he's going around and he's stabbing them with the spear or with the lance. I don't know which, but he's killing everybody that's fallen before Jonathan. And not just the armor bearer. But once that happens, Saul, whatever men he has left, decides to go and start battling against the Philistines. And they start going and they start waging war. And when they get there, the Philistines are killing themselves. They're in turmoil. They're fighting with each other. They're sword against one another. Chaos is reigning. And Saul and his men, there were a maximum of 600. I don't think there were that many at that point. They go into the battle. And all those who are hiding in the cisterns and the caves, they hear what's going on. And they come out. And all of those who had defected and went to the other side, they saw what was happening. They came back and joined Saul. And they come back and join Jonathan. And they start battling. And the battle moves on to Bethaven. It's contagious. It's absolutely contagious. And when we step out in faith, because we know God, love God, believe God, trust God, and obey God, when we do those things and we step out in faith, others will come along. I told you about the young girl in Iowa who stood up and gave her testimony, just like Johnny's aunt did, made the testimony. It's me. I'm the one who needs to be saved. When Sarah stood up and spoke that, then God opened the floodgates of heaven, and people after person, and the person kept coming. You know, we give an invitation, and we invite you to come forward. And the reason we do that is because Jesus made a statement that you cannot be touched by God and not testify. Remember the story that Jesus is walking with his disciples through the crowd, and a woman comes up and she touches the hem of his garment, and she's healed? Now, if you read that in the Greek, you read that there and you read it, it says that Jesus was being crushed by the crowd. He's being crushed. There's so many multitudes of people around him. And she reaches up and just touches the hem of his garment and is healed by God. And Jesus stopped and he turns to his disciples. In the Greek, he says, "Who touched me? Who touched me?" You ever been in a mosh pit? You know what a mosh pit is? A mosh pit is where all these young kids get together for a rock concert and they're all jumping and bopping and smashing into each other. That's what Jesus was like. He was being crushed by the crowd. But he stops and says, "Who touched me?" In the Greek, the disciples say, "Are you nuts? Who didn't?" That's the implication. Who didn't touch you? This whole crowd's touching you. And Jesus stopped and said, "No, you cannot be touched by God and not proclaim it. You must share it, or you're in disobedience to God." She touched him and was healed and was not going to say anything till Jesus said, "No, no, 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 you can't do that." And I'm saying to you, no, 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 you can't do that. You cannot be touched by God and not proclaim it. You must proclaim it. And you know what? The moment the first person walks down this aisle, others will follow. They'll follow. It's kind of like when I used to teach community college, I would say to my students, you know, there's only one dumb question. You know what the only dumb question is? The one you didn't ask. Because the moment you ask it, there's 10 other people who are thinking that question, just didn't verbalize it, and they want the answer too. When you come to proclaim that God has touched you, others will get up with the courage and come forward to say that God has touched them. It's contagious. None of you flinched when I read through you the list of men and women who have made a difference. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Abraham Lincoln, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, Audie Murphy, Lee Harvey Oswald, Osama bin Laden, Charlie Kirk, Corrie ten Boom, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You didn't even flinch then. Osama bin Laden, Lee Harvey Oswald, they affected nations. I remember as a kid the day Kennedy was shot and killed. I'm 72 years old and I still remember it as fresh as it was the day it happened. I also remember where I was on the morning of 9/11. Debbie and I had just returned from Washington, D.C. We had just gotten home late that night. The deacon in my church called me and said, "Pastor, you know, where you were is now gone. I said, where it was is now what? He said, turn on the TV. You're not watching the news? No, and I turned it on. We can infect people either positively for the Lord or negatively against the Lord. We are contagious. We know what contagious is. We just went through the pandemic. Maybe it wasn't as bad here as it was in Chicago, but we couldn't have church for months. We could only have 10 people come to a worship service at a time. And they had to sit for months. We weren't allowed. It just wouldn't happen. We did online. I did Zoom church. I was an interim at a church at the time, and I did church services online. Zoom. I taught all my pastors how to do church online. We went through a pandemic. We know what it was like. I had COVID 4 times. 3 times I had COVID long. I know what it means to be around somebody who's contagious. We can either be contagious for God or contagious for Satan in the world. It just happens. In 1 Samuel 13, verses 7 8, Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. Saul was afraid. And because Saul was afraid, all of his men were afraid. And they started running away in fear. I guarantee you, if I was your pastor and I got up here and I was in a bad mood, by the time you left on Sunday morning, you would all be in a bad mood. It happens. You don't know my wife real well, but my wife is known for her laughter. She has contagious laughter. When she gets going, you're going to start laughing, even if you don't know what's going on. When I would leave a church to go to a new pastorate, they would say, oh, bye, pastor, just leave Debbie. Every time. Got a complex about it. Because she was contagious with her joy and her laughter. We're either contagious for the Lord or we're contagious for Satan in the ways of the world. Which one are you contagious for? Who are we contagious for? Are we spreading faith or are we spreading fear? What are we spreading? Last thing. And that doesn't mean it will be done in a paragraph. Last point. In verses 13 and 14, it says, Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet, his armor bearer right behind him, and the Philistines fell before Jonathan. His armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In the first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. Verse 15 of chapter 14 says, Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts, and the raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic set by God. Verse 23 says, So the Lord rescued Israel that day, and the battle moved on beyond Beth-aven. When we put our victorious faith into action, it is victorious faith. When we take that acting faith that sees the opportunities that God sees us, when we take our acting faith and we are contagious on behalf of the Lord, we are victorious in the battles that we will wage. We will win. They fell before him. He didn't touch them. They saw something. What I believe they saw was the Shekinah glory of God that was hovering around Jonathan as he was walking towards them, and they were just falling over in fright, and they were just passing out, kind of like the sheep quivering and shaking under the bush, and the armor bearer was coming along, and he was killing every single one of them that fell and was paralyzed. And it was victorious. Not just those 20 men that Jonathan the armor bearer killed, but the whole Philistine army was routed. All those multitude like men, like sand on the seashore, they all were routed and ran away. They were terrified. They were killing themselves. Look at it said, not just those in front of him, but those who were out in the raiding parties, they were terrified. Those in the other parts of the camp, they were terrified. God shook the earth as a result of Jonathan's faith being put into action. And they fell before him. What is more exciting than seeing God's faith put into action and you experiencing it? Either as the recipient, where the old man is gone and the new creation is there, or you lead somebody into the kingdom of God and you see the joy come into their life. You see the light come on in their eyes. You see the hope that they have now that they didn't before. Time and time and time again, when we put our faith into action, God gives us the victory. Victory over sin. Victory over darkness. Victory over the enemy. Victory in bringing people into the kingdom of God. Now, I don't know what your tradition is on baptisms here, but when I was pastor and say Danny led something to the Lord, he would baptize them, not me. Because there's nothing more exciting than finishing what you started and seeing somebody come up out of the water as a symbol of what God has done in their life and rejoicing with them together. I have to do that now because I can't get you up if I get you down. You know, I used to say to people, if you're not going to walk in the newness of life, I'll just leave you down. You can go home and be with Jesus. If you promise you'll walk in the newness of life, I'll bring you back up. Now, if I got you down, I'm going to leave you down unless you get up on your own because I can't get you back up. My back and shoulders won't allow it. But what a joy is if you get to baptize someone you led to the kingdom. Pastors get to do it all the time. Now, I know that according to church history, the pastor must be in the waters to represent the church. Okay, I'll stand in there and you do the baptism. You know, Jesus allowed the disciples to baptize. Jesus didn't baptize anybody. Paul rarely ever baptized anybody. He let his disciples, baptize people. Because you know what? You really can't mess up a baptism. You can't. You can try all you want, but you can't mess it up. You may be like me and leave them down and can't get them back up, but you know what? Everybody has a tendency to get up on their own. No matter what I do, you're going to come back up. I was telling these guys that I'm teaching new pastors, practical pastoring. One of the classes we're going to do is baptisms. And they're going to have to baptize them, somebody else in the class, and they're going to get baptized themselves just for the practice of it. I baptized, when I first started in ministry, I baptized a guy that was 6'9". I baptized a guy that was a farmer that was almost between 300 and 400 pounds of solid muscle. He was bigger than I was. And I baptized an 80-year-old, 80-pound woman. Guess which one was the hardest one to baptize? Yeah, the 80-year-old one. The tall guy, he just folded up like an aquarium, went down, an accordion, and he was popped right back up. The big guy, he floated. He just got down, and he floated, and I got him back up. She didn't tell me she was terrified of water. It took everything I had to push that woman under the water. Debbie said the other night, and I never thought about it, I got all but this much of her face in the water. Debbie said her nose doesn't get to go to heaven. I couldn't get her down. She fought like a wildcat. I said, why didn't you tell me? But you know what? I never have forgotten it. And that was back in the 80s. When we put our faith into action, we will see the opportunities. We will be victorious. And we're contagious. Now, I never thought about it till I got up here tonight when I was thinking about the armor bearer going with Jonathan. Jonathan really was doing disciple making. He was taking this young man with him to teach him how to put faith into action. And when we go out and we visit or we share or we minister, we need to take somebody that's a new believer with us to teach them. We need to do that. We need to be teaching the younger generation how to have active faith that is contagious and victorious and seize the opportunities before you. We need to be doing that all of the time. Jesus said, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. This is the final words that I'll be speaking to you till maybe I get invited back sometime. But let me say this. As Jesus has sent me, so send I you. I want you to take what you've learned in this pilgrimage. I don't want you to see the opportunities that God is giving you in the days ahead. I want you to be contagious in your faith. And I want you to be victorious in Jesus. The victory in Jesus is yours. Ron said, you won't know how well revival has gone till I'm gone. And that's true. But I hope to hear from you. I hope to hear what God is doing as you are putting your faith into action, as you're going out in search of those sheep who are not a part of this flock. That you need to go, that they might hear the voice of Christ and come and be part of one flock with one shepherd. So as I leave, I say to you, as God has sent me, so send I you. Go out, see the opportunities, be contagious, be victorious. See this place multiply. And I will close with this illustration. Years ago, when the Ukraine opened up and Russia was opening up to the gospel message, it had been closed like China. We could not get in and share. And in the country of Ukraine, which is now in war, but back then, we sent missionaries to the Ukraine. And they started sharing the gospel. And they were leading people to Christ. The victory was happening. The generations of prayer for Russia and prayers for the Ukraine were being answered. The people that were going, they were being contagious, and they were seeing all the opportunities, and they were taking advantage of them, and the victory was coming. They started out in a small building that they had church services in, and they outgrew it, so they went to and found another building, and they rented it, and they outgrew it. And so they started looking around, and they found the biggest building in the community. And the biggest building in the community happened to have a sign above it that said KGB. And so they rented the KGB building. And they started having services there. And after 2 weeks of meeting in the KGB building, which was a massive building, they put a sign out on the door that said, if you are a believer in Jesus Christ, you are not welcome to come in today. And people said, but you're church. And the church members were saying, but we've come to church. And they said, no, you can't come in. And the members said, why can't we come in? He said, because we need your seat for lost people who are coming. You can't come in. Go home and worship with your family. We need the space. There's no bigger building in the community for us to reach. And we have people come in, and they had lost people coming by the hundreds and sitting in the pews and the seats. And if you were a believer, you were not allowed to come in because they just didn't have any space for you. I want to see the sign that you put on your door in the months ahead to say, if you're a believer, you can't come in because we need the seats for lost people who are coming wanting to hear about Jesus. You're saying, Dr. Dan, that's ridiculous. I don't know. I've always had the dream to see that. I've always had the dream to see churches have multiple services. Not one, not two, not three, not four, not five, but 10 or 12 every week. Same services, 10, 12 times, with new people coming to hear the message of hope. I believe it can happen. Do you? Do you believe it can happen? Now, I mean, that's stepping outside your comfort zone. You know, if we filled this place up and had to fill it up 11 more times, that means, that many more people you don't know are coming in. Well, maybe you know them. It might be family. But that's what it's all about. Remember last night in the message, Jesus was gathering and having a meal with the tax collectors and the sinners. And he was meeting with the lost people. And he didn't care what anybody thought because he loved them and he wanted them to be a part of his kingdom. We need to have that same love. We need to have that same desire. We need to have that same willingness to sit with those who are non-believers, to sit with those who are new believers, to open the door and let somebody sit in your seat. Debbie and I were pastoring a church as an interim in our association, and I said, what are you not willing to give up for the kingdom of God? And everybody said, we'll give up anything. They gave me the Sunday school answer. I said, good, next week you can't sit where you're sitting right now. You can't sit where you're sitting right now. Click, click. And so the next week when I came back, Debbie watched, and people were sitting where they weren't had sit there before. She went to them and moved them. She picked up their Bibles and put them somewhere else. They picked up their cushions or their sweaters or whatever they had in their place where they always sat. She moved them. And I thought it was going to be the older people that were going to give me a hard time. It was the young people who gave me the hard time. One of the young deacons said, no, my family won't find me. And Debbie said, what? Sanctuary's no bigger than this. They know who you are. They'll find you. And a little boy who was about 8 years old was sitting behind me like where Ron was sitting. I was sitting there, and he kept saying, Mom, why can't we sit where we always sit? Mom, why are we sitting here? And Mom was trying to be polite because I was sitting right in front of her, and she wouldn't answer. And I finally turned around and said, my fault. I said, you can't sit where you always sit. You got to be willing to give up for others to get. Now, I've been to churches, and Debbie and I both, we come in and we sit down. We're the first people in the sanctuary. We sit down, and people come up, tap us on the shoulder, and say, you're sitting in my seat. You got to move. And made us move. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, but multiple times we've been told that. You can't sit there. One was a really huge church in Las Vegas, and Debbie and I both looked at her and said, there's 500 seats in here. So we moved. Take what you've learned this week, put it into action. Be contagious with your faith. See the opportunity God's given you, and have the victory in Jesus. Brother Ron.